essentially how Kubernetes actually schedules a container. Now, you see pod up here, pod and container. For all practical purposes for this discussion, let's assume pod equals container. The idea here is that the user says, create a pod, writes that into the API server. You'll see that every action here goes through the API server. The API server then writes that into etcd, and it says, OK, got it. You want me to create a pod, and then returns that call to the user. So this is essentially saying, I've registered that you want a pod. Meanwhile, that scheduler is saying, oh, I noticed that there's a new pod that hasn't been assigned to a node. Let me go ahead, let me make that decision of where I'm going to assign that pod, write that back into etcd. And so now we've modified that record in the database that says the user wants a pod, and then the scheduler says, well, I've annotated that record, and here's the node that I'm binding that pod to. Here's the node that I'm assigning the pod to. And then it returns. And then the kubelet, it wakes up and it notices that, hey, look, there's a new pod that's assigned to me. Let me look to see if it's already running. It's not already running. Well, let me, I should make relentless forward progress. Let me do what I need to do to be able to make that pod run. Maybe that's downloading container images. Maybe that's communicating to Docker. So eventually, that'll essentially, in effect, do a Docker run. And then it'll update the status back to the API server. That status will get written at etcd, and then everything goes ahead and returns. And so what you see here is that there's 3 distinct actions here. There's the user creating the pod, there's the scheduler binding it, and then there's the kubelet that actually runs the thing. And what you'll also see is that the user doesn't talk to the scheduler, and the scheduler doesn't talk to the kubelet. All this communication actually goes through modifying modifying records in the core database. And this is, I think, again, it's like we're modifying state, and then other stuff is reacting to that state.